Today we're covering how to get from here to there. Let's take a moment to set this to the side and think through what are some of the basic needs and wants as established by international aid agencies. So just take a moment and think about what is the order that you would put your basic needs and wants. Now, some of them are relatively straightforward, like probably food and water and clothing, protection from the elements, basic sanitation, shelter, healthcare, transportation, communication. The very interesting thing that international aid agencies have found in a number of studies in developing economies is that at a certain point, even after a very low level of, say, food, just the very, very, very basics within food, the next item that individuals will purchase when they get the funds will be for communication. So they'll buy a cell phone and a cell plan. And the reason for that is that with communication, these other elements can become a lot easier, that you can facilitate your healthcare, your transportation, getting a job. All of these things can be facilitated through communication. And so as you're thinking through your basic needs and wants, recognize how these basic needs are actually interconnected. That say if we skimp on one area of our life, it cascades into the others. For example, at a very basic level, if we don't sleep enough, we can see that show up in the other areas of our life. And that's true with our time. It's also true with our money. It's also true with our budgets. So how can you get to where you want to go? Well, if you think for a moment, you could probably generate a pretty good list, but here's one list that I came up with. You could walk to where you need to. You could bike, you could take a car, you could take a bus, you could go to work every day by train in some places, and some people even take a commute to work using a plane. But before we get into how do we get where you want to, how do you get from point A to point B, the first is how do we define point A? Now this is the taking a step back. There's an article below for you to go through, Mr. Money Mustache article. But the first thing that you need to consider is where you live determines how far you need to go. So one of the simplest ways to reduce transportation costs to get from point A to point B is to change where point A is. And so one way of doing this is just to live next to work to solve your transportation issues. It's relatively straightforward. And you remember your goals that you set? So along with your goals, you probably didn't have your goals as I'm going to spend a lot of time and money just sitting in traffic, wishing I was somewhere else. And finally, taking all of this into account as far as where point A is where you live, you need to take into account the cost, the all-in cost, the time that you're going to be spending, and also the risk. Because, for example, for a person my age, the number one risk to my life is drug overdose. The second most likely risk is suicide. The third is a car accident, which is it's not a negligible risk. So take into account the cost, time, and risk involved in where point A is going to be. So check out the article below. But kind of the punchline is that for these friends of Mr. Money Mustache, the difference is like $125,000 across 10 years for this situation. Or $15,900 could be spent on a home for each mile closer that you live to work at a 5% interest rate. Now, it takes certain assumptions to generate that number of $15,900. If you're on the more conservative end, it's closer to say $5,000 or $6,000, but that's still significant. So he used certain numbers for his assumptions, and yours will be slightly different depending on your car, your situation, how you value your time. But just the last thing to remember with this is the probability of an accident. This is something that needs to be taken into account. Now, surprisingly, in many areas of the United States, including a lot of places where I've lived, the cost of housing isn't astronomical like it is in some big cities today. And so transportation ends up being a similar size of your budget as housing. And especially where housing costs can be low, you can end up, say, with larger vehicles, longer commutes, or in terms of more miles that are traveled. And so slicing up different areas, different subregions of the United States, you can come out with expenses for an average annual cost that's close to, say, $10,000 for housing and $10,000 for transportation. And so if you're trying to make a significant impact on what you're spending every year, actually moving the needle on transportation can have a bigger impact than moving the needle on housing. Now, most people in the United States use a vehicle for getting around, for transportation to get to work. Now, for your situation, one thing to be aware of as far as our psychological biases, there are certain costs that we tend to overestimate systematically and other costs that we tend to underestimate systematically. So I wanted to play a little game. So I want you to think of, what do you think the average cost per year is for each one of these categories on average? So let's say fuel. Fuel, how much do you spend per year? Think of a number. So the real number is $1,681. Now you might actually be pretty close to that number, partially because every time you fill up the car, you stare at the number and you stare at the price. So that one people tend to actually get relatively close. What about tires? How much do tires cost per year on average? How much are you going to spend total cost on all tires for the year? Well, it ends up to be about $147. This isn't something you buy every year, so this is going to be a lumpy expense. Some years lots, some years little. What about maintenance and repairs? That comes out around $766 per year. Again, lumpy, some years a lot, some years a little. Taxes, license, and registration. This is going to be influenced largely by where you live. In some states, the taxes, license, and registration is quite expensive. Other states is actually a lot lower, a lot more reasonable. But that comes in around $665. What about insurance? Total insurance costs per year across an entire year, not just 6 months. About $1,115. A depreciation. How much your car is worth less every single year. Now that's going to be lumpy because you're going to buy new cars every once in a while. So this is a very lumpy expense in terms of cash. But that comes to $3,654 per year. And financing charges, if you are borrowing money, the average in the United States is around $669. And last, as far as annual costs, don't forget to take into account your time. So here's a graphic from AAA. AAA has some pretty accurate estimations of this from year to year. This is the 2015 numbers, but these numbers have stayed relatively contained within the same range. And so you should be expecting, if you're the average or typical household, you should be seeing numbers that are somewhat similar to this, depending on, of course, where you live and, of course, the state and some of those items. So $8,700, that's a lot. Maybe you want to cut back on this and you say, well, I'm going to start biking or maybe walking. So on the pro side, it's a lot cheaper than a vehicle, and it's this free and motivating exercise, so it's healthy. On the con side, some people have cited the danger of biking or walking. You could argue it's dangerous not to, because as far as the health benefits, you don't get those health benefits. You also don't get that, time back. It takes longer. So that takes us to public transit. And now, public transit, the pros, it's far cheaper than a car, and also can free up your time. There are things that you can do while you are traveling to work, let's say. And plus, you get a little bit of walking, say, to wherever this is, and from wherever this is, wherever, let's say, a train station or something like that is. On the con side, you have decreased flexibility, and it takes a little bit longer. Sometimes you don't have public transit going where you need to go, so that can hold you back to a degree. So how do you know which method to take? Well, that just, again, rolls back to your goals. What are you trying to achieve? Which of these do you value more as far as health, exercise, time, money? These are all trade-offs that you need to select based off of your overall goals. So because most people own a vehicle in the United States of some sort, we'll be discussing just for a few minutes auto insurance. First, yes, you need to get it. It's illegal not to get it if you do own a car. But you do need to do your homework because there are a lot of areas that auto insurance can cover or not cover. And I've included a really helpful article below that walks through each one of these so that you can best understand what's best for your specific situation. So how much insurance do you need? And the thing to remember is that on average, you do lose money on insurance. Insurance is not a moneymaker, but there's a certain value in transferring that risk to somebody else. And so the key line from the article, just to remember, is to choose the highest deductible that you can afford. So you decide, okay, I need to go buy my auto insurance. Now, where should I go? There are many, many, many different options that are out there. And I'm not here to comment on any one in particular, but provide kind of a framework for as far as selecting and switching insurance. Now, of course, you do want to shop around and you want to make sure that you're comparing similar types and similar levels of insurance to the different places that you're going to see if it's worth it there or not. But one of the things that people don't realize is that after you've owned, say, auto insurance for a few years with the same company, not enough people bother to shop around when they renewal. They just kind of say yes. And what this does on the auto insurers, from the auto insurer's perspective, it gives them this incentive to hike up your rate and take advantage of you if you're not looking around for a more competitive rate. And so it's kind of like, say, some landlords that just raise rent by, say, 10% every year, because they think they can, and there will be a certain percentage that just won't move or won't do anything about it. So for most people, they're actually best off switching insurance about every few years. You don't usually not every 6 months, but usually every few years they end up saving. And so you'll hear this you'll hear this advertised by auto insurers, and they'll say, "Oh, the average person saved 30% switching to us." And then another company says the average person saved 30% switching to us too. And that doesn't mean that one is just way cheaper than the others. It means that once you start buying, your rates go up over time and they hike them. And if you switch, you end up benefiting from a 15, 20, 30% reduction in your insurance rates, but your total insurance costs potentially. And that's because you're switching, not because the company is necessarily better. So remember to shop around. And on top of this, just drive safe. This is very underemphasized. Follow the law. But lastly, as far as avoiding car accidents, this is not very personal finance, but just some personal advice. And it was some great advice that I was given once, and it had to do with as far as evaluating our own abilities. But the example that was used was, do you think that you are a good driver? Like, you've spent, depending on your age, thousands or tens of thousands of hours driving. And yet most people aren't very good at it. In fact, most people are still relatively bad at driving, even though they've spent thousands or tens of thousands of hours. And the reason why, it's we're not engaging in deliberate practice trying to improve as we're driving. We're not trying to get a high score in safety as we're driving. But it's something that we should consider doing to improve our driving capabilities, to reduce our risks of causing an accident, endangering ourselves, endangering other people, and receiving tickets. So we are going to move on to life insurance.